cameras, Laura Avelino, Rania Elizawi, and Fernanda Baumhart. First, we will open the floor to Laura, whom is part of the Canadian Red Cross. Laura started her job in emergency management in 2013. She started working in 2009. Currently, she is the senior management of the information management for the Canadian Red Cross. She's supporting the operation leaders for the emergency response based in data. Laura, through her career, has acquired experience in the emergency response, not only national but international, in this management for emergency humanitarian response. She has managed data, the culture, also working in the implementation of common response in the humanitarian response. Each one of you will have 10 minutes for your presentation, and then we will have the panel for Q&A session. So Lara, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction. So I will be presenting in English, and so I'll try and make sure that I'm keeping a good pace for any translation, but please just let me know in the chat if I either need to repeat or slow down. And I'm just going to share my screen, if you'll bear with me for a second. And any lag, of course. Okay. So I'll try and go through this quickly to make sure that we have time for our panel discussion at the end. And so I'm happy to answer any additional questions at the end or handle them in the chat. But before I go into a bit of our work in the Canadian Red Cross with community mapping, I wanted to start making sure that we are speaking from the same baseline. And so particularly when acknowledging that our program looked to focus on working with Indigenous communities and remote communities in Canada, I want to make sure that when we speak about Indigenous communities, very quickly acknowledging that Indigenous means for us First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in the land that is now known as Canada. These are collections of hundreds of nations with unique lands, cultures, identities, languages, and histories. And what we now know as Canada exists on ceded and unceded territories. And these historical events that led to these boundaries being drawn and this land, the changes that came to this land resulted in environments of mistrust of outsiders. And so particularly as we're talking about mapping and as we're talking about engaging with communities and in this digital infrastructure, we want to make sure that we're working with this historical knowledge in mind. And also to give an idea of the size of Canada, that's the boundaries of Germany, superseded on just not even 2 full provinces in the country. So we're working with a very large landmass. There we go. Additionally, acknowledging and understanding that mapping in and of itself is a political issue. Maps are political tools. They've been used as such historically and continue to be used that way. And while they're powerful, we have to understand that drawing boundaries indicates ownership and authority. And most maps historically, and especially those that we use day to day, have been determined and their boundaries have been determined by outsiders defining land as they interpret it. Additionally, when you don't take care, while maps are a beautiful and powerful storytelling tool, they may also result in the sharing of traditional knowledge without consultation if data is simply displayed without it being community driven. Additionally, historically, the use of maps and this way to disseminate information has been a means to exploit land and individuals. But that's not the only context I want to share with you. As you might have seen in the first slide, or as you might have noticed, Canada in and of itself is very large. Our community mapping initiatives work work largely with open data, and so using something called OpenStreetMaps. Well, I won't go into this in detail today. This project started as a part of Missing Maps, which is a global initiative that includes both Red Crosses as well as Médecins Sans Frontières, who are MSF, Doctors Without Borders, and other agencies as well. We use community mapping, and so we don't necessarily only use OpenStreetMaps, which is why I'm speaking about community mapping today and not Missing Maps specifically. But with that, acknowledging that outside of OpenStreetMaps, and so in open platforms or platforms that we're all used to, like Google Maps, Canada is generally very well mapped. This isn't universally true, and we do see challenges even in things like Google Maps or other sources of information where there's a gap in knowledge, a gap in mapping, or a gap in data in rural and remote communities. But also acknowledging that the platform we are working on, OpenStreetMaps, within it, data coverage is quite inconsistent. And relative to our landmass, we have a very small Canadian community within OpenStreetMaps. In general, it's also the case that cities often have more data available than rural communities. And so you can see there on the images that in Ottawa, which is our nation's capital, we have quite a lot of detail. In Banff and Merritt, which are smaller cities, but they have high levels of tourism, we do have a good amount of information. We can see that there's some building names, that there's street names, etc. But in northern Manitoba, and to acknowledge as well that the scale, we've zoomed out for that image of northern Manitoba, there's nothing. There's very, very little. And this is a much more rural and remote community that we're looking at. For Indigenous data specifically, this Indigenous community presence is generally undermapped. Where it is mapped, we often find legal reserve boundaries only. We don't find information on traditional land use. And what is there can often lack cultural perspectives. Particularly with open data networks, we have seen and have heard some stories from others about communities that have been mapped by outsiders, and where there has been importation, so they've imported data in on Indigenous features that are not represented by current tagging standards. And so if it is there, it's not representative. And even if it were, it's not tagged in a way that makes sense to the local context. So to introduce the project that we worked on and that we have been engaged with since 2000, particularly our in-person project was from 2018 to 2020. But this is the Canadian Red Cross's Missing Maps pilot project at that time. And it's evolved a little bit, which I can talk about at the end. But first, I'll be framing this in two ways. So first, I'll be talking about operationalizing community engagement. And so why did we do this? And what frameworks does it fall under? And secondly, I'll be talking a little bit about our community mapping experiences. While we engaged with multiple communities, I'll be doing that by giving a broad overview of our experiences with two communities. So why did we do this? When we're looking at community engagement, really the purposes of engaging in mapping in particular was to look at first our disaster risk reduction. And so we have staff throughout Canada within the Canadian Red Cross that are experts in this, and we have a disaster risk reduction framework and ways that we engage with communities. They work within disaster impacted and vulnerable communities to understand risks, both after a response, after an operation, as well as before, in order to make sure, of course, we know mitigation is the best thing that we can do. And so to make sure that people understand what those risks are and are able to act to mitigate them. The way that we work with communities is to facilitate individual and community level action, and with the goal of building community resiliency. And to do all of this, we know that maps are powerful tools for identifying risks as well as vulnerabilities and capacities. So where the strengths are in communities, just as much as where there are these risks and vulnerabilities. But as we mentioned before, we know that mapping data in Canada doesn't always lend itself to that. And where it does, and if it is on Google Maps, unfortunately, that also means that it's behind a paywall. So even if large agencies are able to access it, which, as many agencies engaging in these spaces are nonprofits, maybe they're not, communities themselves are facing large financial and logistical barriers to do so. So secondly, working within the Indigenous framework. In Canadian Red Cross, we do have a strong Indigenous peoples team, and we have an Indigenous framework that guides how we work within this context. So a couple of guiding principles is respect. Apologies, I received a notice that I got muted and unmuted, so I'm not sure if this means my audio is not great.
Laura, you are in mute.
Okay,
No?
yes, I'm receiving a notice that the host is muting me. So I'll keep an eye to see if anything is changing. But is my audio okay right now?
Yes, right now.
Okay.
No.
Okay, good. So just restarting on the slide, as I'm not sure where maybe my audio started to, or my technology started to go off. But going back to why we are engaging in this and how we're structuring ourselves. So working within the Indigenous framework, we're lucky to work with an Indigenous Peoples Department. And so we have subject matter experts, which is certainly not myself, but we're very lucky to work with them and be advised by them. But within Canadian Red Cross, we do have an Indigenous framework, and some of the guiding principles to highlight that we worked with, though these are not all of them, respect and acknowledgement. And so we understand that these are independent nations with their own political structures, and that maps should be serving the communities and individuals to organize themselves and understand their risk. A holistic approach. And so making sure that whatever work we are doing is guided by principles of well-being, community capacity, and resiliency, and that our work is community-driven and accountable. So to start with a little bit of the context, first and foremost, with both of the case studies that I'll present today, I want you to take away that the themes are consultation and community ownership, and that means both understanding the context and why we're going to engage in a project, but also that determines the what we deliver in a project. So the first case study I'll talk about is where we worked with a rural Anishinaabe community. This community shares resources and learnings with two neighboring nations, but they often lead on the initiatives before their neighbors are able to follow suit. They share particularly resources around emergency response. And so this is police, ambulance, and fire. They're involved in many environmental consultations, but they are the only signing member of its regional treaty. And so when it came to determining activities, the priority was supporting improved coordination of emergency services. And part of the priority here was making sure that we were able to allow and enable emergency responders to know where the community is. And so you can see in the picture here on the right is actually the coordinator for this program, Nalini Shabit, or at the time. And she worked with community members to do an in-car field survey and collect and digitize where people are. And so where there are house numbers, validating in actual community names in Indigenous languages. And we were both able to digitize that and input it into the open system, as well as create a large printout map for use in emergency scenario training and leave that with the community for their usage. And the last case study that I'll go in, and sorry, Jitong, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, Laura, I'm sorry for interrupt you. We only have 10 minutes for each presentation. So if you wrap up in 1 minute, please.
I can do that. Okay. And so the context for this community is that the land was once used for traditional purposes and is now highly industrialized. They are now post-disaster, so they had severe wildfires within the last several years, and we've already built a relationship with them there. But now the land has changed. And so what maps previously existed have been highly impacted by the fires. So there we conducted field surveys and were able to map the current conditions using field papers as well as using digital means. And we established a method to map out pre and post fire residencies of members, and we're able to leave that behind and train community members to take ownership of that data. So quickly into successes, I outlined a couple already and mentioned them briefly. So culturally appropriate names, maps that helped sort out where people are, so reserve housing, as well as maps and means of mapping that enabled storytelling. And as part of Canadian history and the history that we have with Indigenous communities, leaving that data ownership where the community wanted it. So whether it was open or in their own hands, in a private server or their own computers, is what we see as part of how we can work within a reconciliation framework. That also means there were lots of challenges. And so particularly in building relationships, you're only going to get as good as data as people provide. And so we had to make sure to coordinate community visits and activities and work in person with groups. So that also meant defining what it means to get permission from communities to map and teaching OpenStreetMaps and technologies to participants who maybe were volunteers and doing this wherever they were able to fit it. In addition to, of course, the logistical issues of, as I mentioned, remote communities, they may not have strong internet or may have no internet during certain times of the year. And with winter travel, they may be inaccessible. And so making sure to prioritize your time and coordinate effectively. So with that, I'll hand the mic back.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. So we are going to pass to the next panelist for this session, who is Pamela Perrault from the Firelight Group. Pamela is member of the Garden River First Nation on Ontario and director of the Firelight Group. Pamela, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Ani Bojo Maningajep, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much for the invite. So I'm going to share my screen as well. So as I was introduced, I am a First Nations person, part of the Indigenous groups that Laura mentioned earlier. Thank you very much, Laura, for your presentation. I think I can remove about 5 slides from my context. So I am from Kitigan-ZB, where the 3 largest Great Lakes in the country come together. That's my community. My dad is from there, and my mom is from Batchewana First Nation. But I have the pleasure and the honor of living on the west coast of our country, on the east coast of Vancouver Island, in the traditional territory of the Nanoose First Nations people. So part of our process that we do here, and Laura mentioned it already, is we do territorial acknowledgements. We always acknowledge that for a young country, the rights and the presence of Indigenous peoples is first and foremost in our minds, and really important in terms of the political and economic development decisions that we are now embarking on in the country. So I am a director owner of the Firelight Group. We are one of the few Indigenous owned companies in the country. We are a private firm. We are researchers. We have a staff of about 85 people across the country. And we've been in existence for going on 14 years now. And we started with a cartographer and a lawyer and somebody who specialized in Indigenous birth and Indigenous birth rights in the far north. So that was some of our origins. But we come, and I will speak to you today from multiple perspectives. We do traditional use studies. We have a very strong GIS department. I work in ecology and in Indigenous planning. We do environmental assessments. We do a lot of negotiation works as well, which we'll understand a bit of the context in a bit. And we do socio-ec studies. So in all of this work that we do, mapping, data, and information management is paramount. So I want to start with the global framework, because in Canada, while we were some of the last to sign on to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we've moved very far quickly in terms of incorporating the UN Declaration in our legislative systems and now in our laws. So for those of you who are less familiar perhaps with the Declaration, or UNDRIP for short form, UNDRIP deals with a spectrum of Indigenous rights. Just very broadly, it talks about and encourages, and I guess really makes known publicly that there are international standards for the prohibition of discrimination against Indigenous peoples. And it's really a makeup of 46 articles. But when I talk about UNDRIP, I really encourage and emphasize that while there are particular aspects and certain articles that might be favorites of people, the whole UNDRIP document should be read from beginning to end, the preamble right to the very last article. And the reason for this, I broke all the rules here of slide presentation. I apologize. Because the articles themselves
Porque
build
los
on each other
artículos como tal
and they work together.
construyen el uno sobre el otro y trabajan en conjunto.
So
Sorry.
in terms of the important articles related particularly to engagement with Indigenous peoples, I've got them listed here, but I'd like to just focus Article 30 and 32, which talk about effective consultations. It talks about the state's responsibility to consult and cooperate in good faith. And then importantly, I'll talk a little bit about the requirement to obtain free, prior, and informed consent. So while UNDRIP is an international instrument, in Canada, we are moving it fairly quickly into our legal system. I live in a province called British Columbia, and we actually have our own law at the provincial level called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So what we're seeing is that we have national laws from coast to coast to coast, and they're gradually being brought into effect and being implemented at the provincial and at the ground level. And this has significant impacts on how we map and how we discuss information and data management. So what is free, prior, and informed consent? Free, of course, is that all decisions are given voluntarily without coercion, intimidation, or manipulation. This is harder to achieve than most people think. And particularly in a country like Canada, most people globally feel that Canada should be able to achieve this. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Prior, we talk about decisions being made and decisions being discussed and the need to have a decision made well in advance of any sort of infringement or impact on Indigenous rights by any sort of development activity. So what's important for this presentation is the informed aspect. Free, prior, and informed consent, a large part of this process, in order for it to be effective and actually representative of the true intent, is that all parties, and in this case, I'm talking specifically about Indigenous peoples, need to have the information available to them. For example, if a project is being proposed for development that's going to impact their rights in their territory, in their place of residence, all information needs to be provided. But importantly, it has to be provided in a manner that can be understood by the community. So we have a long history in Canada of a lot of large development plans being dropped on the desk or at the office in First Nation communities that are 2,000 pages of very technical jargon, and that being called consultation. That's not acceptable anymore in even under our laws. So informed, and what what does it mean to be informed? How does a community know that it's informed? How does a proponent or developer decide the level of information to share so that that community is informed? That's a big part of the work that we do at Firelight. And consent, of course, is the final decision. So why this is important is because consent, while it's the decision, and consent seems like a very positive decision going forward, what is important and outlined in UNDRIP and in international laws that have come out of the FPIC discussions and other international instruments is that Indigenous peoples also have the right to withhold consent. So it's not a guaranteed outcome that if a proponent, a developer provides information, engages with a community and makes best effort, it's not a guaranteed result that a community will give a positive outcome and will say, yes, go ahead. So that's really important to understand. So this map was already shown. This is why it's important in the Canadian context, but also too, really importantly from an international perspective and just understanding that Canada is a very young country. And while its international border hasn't changed, there's a lot of change that's happening internally within provinces. So when we do our work, when we work on mapping projects with Indigenous communities, we have some general principles that I'm noticing has been the theme of today. We work in collaboration. Everything is participatory. It's inclusive, transparent, innovative. We try to be innovative as much as we possibly can. Often this requires having the community actually lead processes. We are flexible, but in Canada as well, something that is incredibly important and dear to our work as Firelight is we follow principles of OCAP. So ownership, control, access, and possession. It means that all information that is shared by the community members and the community as a collective is owned, controlled, accessible, and possessed by them. And like Laura mentioned before, how that is held and how that information and data is held is totally in the control of the community that we work with. So what we do a lot of work in our development projects, particularly, is we are trying to understand and communicate Indigenous values to proponents and to governments. So we can only do that through engagement. We involve all aspects of the community, again, thinking of cultural protocols, but also thinking of the guiding principles of UNDRIP, children, youth, adults, elders, men, women, all groups within a community. We often have to do this just for efficiency, and also it's actually more participatory and people enjoy it more as we create committees. Many of the communities that we work with in Canada have family groupings still. They still engage and interact on the land in a family way. Sometimes they're called for example, in British Columbia, you might have a KO, or on the eastern side of the country, we have trapline holders. And the way people organize themselves and how they interact on the land is a very important aspect of knowing how to properly map and collect and store information. A very important aspect of our work is once all of the mapping happens, we go through verification. So all maps, all data, everything goes back into the community. And that is where we have the thick skin as researchers, and we be prepared to get corrected. We hope and we make all possibility and create the space for the community to correct and to really validate and verify the information that we've collected, sorry. I'm seeing a hand up. I've got 1 minute.
Yes, Pamela, thank you for wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. So in that large map that you saw presented, every single one of our communities is impacted by large, major natural resource development, tar sands, fracking for oil and gas. We have a pipeline that crosses the country. We have marine shipping, hydroelectric, and Indigenous communities have to be involved in all of it. This is an example of this is just large scale development of that kind. This is where First Nation communities are found. And in order to engage in part of the process of helping communities become informed and support their own capacity development as well, Firelight has created a number of toolkits. We have an impact benefit agreement community toolkit geared specifically towards communities to help them come forward and take control over their information and data management. We've done the same thing for communities individually, but also for larger organizations like the Major Projects Coalition. So we create the best practices and put all the best tools that we know of in our experience working across the country. We bring them together and specifically target them for the use of Indigenous communities. The other thing that we do that falls in line with the theme that I've heard this morning is we have an Indigenous mapping collective at Firelight. We have a not-for-profit arm. We have an annual meeting, and in the last couple of years, the virtual environment has actually promoted large participation. We have between 900 and 1,000 people will attend this annual event. And it includes 150 sessions. It's capacity building, training, but most importantly, and what happens throughout the rest of the year, we've created what's called a network of Indigenous mappers, and they interact all year long. We share stories, we share tools, technology, and talk about the next year's process of what people would like to learn and hear from each other from around the world. People learn how to facilitate discussion. They learn how to engage with their own communities and collect and store information. And importantly, come together as a group of professional Indigenous people from around the world. And Miigwech, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Pamela, for your presentation. So we are moving to the next presentation with Rania, and sorry for the delay on the different presentations before. Rania, she's part of the UNICEF at the headquarters. She presented on the common community engagement framework yesterday. So Rania, go ahead, the floor is yours for your presentation. Thank you.
Apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I needed to unmute myself first. Thank you so much. And it's really wonderful actually to be part of this panel because, you know, even just listening to the colleagues, I think it really brings us to this scope of what I would like to talk about because when we were asked to come on this panel, it was more to give this comprehensive overview of community engagement standards. And I'm not sure whether all colleagues were on with us yesterday when I was presenting about the community engagement minimum standards that been working on developing with many partners. And yes, we have not worked with Firelight, but we would love to. So just to say that when we're thinking about driving transparency and trust, the focus on the approach to standardization is not just because we want, it's not to say that community engagement is standardized and that's the way it must be applied, but it's more from the operational perspective in order to ensure that as institutions that engage in community engagement, as the other panelists already spoke about, Laura and Pamela, that we drive that transparency and trust building through the implementation and application through the different organizations and institutions, because we're so many different institutions. As UNICEF, an intergovernmental organization representing and practicing in 150 countries, there's so much diversity. We are talking about national institutions as well as local organizations. And when we're thinking about the outcomes that we're trying to drive, it really is about thinking about communities as co-holders of power. So I just wanted to just give the really quick overview again about the minimum standards that I presented on yesterday and shared. And as I mentioned, that this was a result of a 2-year process and country validation processes in many different countries across the world. And the idea was for us to develop standards that could reflect a consensus on how we rethink community engagement and its contribution to governance, to development, to humanitarian, as well as public health responses, but in development goals in general. The idea, of course, is that, as I mentioned, the operationalization is very contingent on which institutions are taking them on board, and then how do they consider that from a resourcing perspective? How do they prioritize based on their organizational mandates and their resources? But also the main thing is, how do we drive resources in a way that we promote community engagement and its evolution and formulation for different communities as co-holders, not recipients, but co-holders of power. So the community engagement minimum standards, I'm not going to go through them in detail just for the limit of the time, because today what I wanted to go a little bit more in detail is how we went the next step in the application of this and in the partnerships that we have been working with globally, whether they are humanitarian academics or humanitarian organizations that are working on the ground, to look at some of the existing guidelines that actually guide how all our institutions internalize and effectively then deliver technical guidance, as well as implement it, as well as how donor resources flow, how government resources flow, and how we manage community engagement implementation. So the initiative that I'm specifically talking about is a social science for community engagement in humanitarian action project. And this project, again, what we aim to do was to develop certain global goods that identify and strengthen how social science capacities can be integrated to improve community engagement programming. We also aim to establish principles that could be common principles recognized by different types of institutions. Of course, they will all implement it in the ways that their mandates allow them to do that, but to establish shared principles and also possible accountability mechanisms for us. And then the last point, because this has been a running theme, I really think that when we start to think about tech, it very much revolves around data oftentimes, but how do we improve those data processes holistically? The data collection, the data generation, information management, data use. What are the considerations and accountability mechanisms that can be put in place there? Where are our actual gaps, but what kind of mechanisms can we put in place as different institutions to facilitate meaningful community engagement and be able to track progress? So this is a overview of this initiative that spanned over the last year. And as I mentioned yesterday, there were, more than 70 plus organizations that work within the humanitarian space. And some of them even represented platforms of humanitarian academicians. We even did have some that represented civil society members, as well as indigenous platforms as well. So it was a journey of how could we find a consensus and learning and be able to work on deliverables that could be applicable and relevant across these different spaces. So one of those key streams was how did we work on data ethics and code of conduct, and what could common principles have to offer? So most of the processes that we did throughout this project included first mapping efforts of existing literature, including gray literature, as well as many interviews, key informant interviews, as well as consultations. And the idea were that at the end of the day, in terms of the ethics and the code of conduct, the common principles that we wanted to establish were to really recognize and elevate that social sciences are always about people, society, culture, and context. And therefore being able to identify those disciplines so that we would be able to drive proper processes, research, as well as decision-making processes that would facilitate that. We some of the key considerations also looked at the ethics around vulnerability and the vulnerable, as we usually refer to different types of populations when we're thinking about the ethics, and that current ethical codes, how necessary and how applicable are they, and are they sufficient? And we looked at what are existing right now within humanitarian practice when we are particularly thinking about data and data management and the use of technology. So really thinking about the ethical perspective on how are decisions made, how is data availed, and how do we ensure that we are inclusive of all populations within these community engagement processes. So, and then the second component was focused on capacity. And what we were aiming to look at within this specific scope was looking at what was the range of capacities and competencies that are within this area of community engagement and social science. How did the capacities actually differ? And of course, based on institutional mandates, again, the capacities and the needs that are required to implement community engagement are a very broad range. And oftentimes, when we're implementing humanitarian responses, we do not accommodate and incorporate the broad range of social science expertise that would help us to be a bit more effective when we are implementing community engagement. So how would we inform the sector and humanitarian actors around those broad range of social science disciplines that would be necessary to influence delivering better? And then the third one, the third area that we focused on was community engagement data, where we really dug deep into what is the current state of community engagement data in general, particularly driving the highest decision-making processes. And so, as we know, as I mentioned, it is about addressing power dynamics. And oftentimes, when we are thinking about how resourcing goes into humanitarian responses, it is very top-down driven. So how much is community engagement data captured from bottom up? And that is a major challenge. And so again, we went through a very three-pronged process that included literature review, surveys with different partners, as well as the literature review looked at humanitarian response plans. So we actually looked at how the humanitarian system is organized and planning around specific humanitarian response that were ongoing. And then we proceeded with doing an analysis to come up with what were the community engagement data gaps and how is community engagement data actually captured. And it's very telling. And just to say that there are quite a number of limitations if we're really going to think about some of the processes that went into this, because when we're thinking about looking at what's existing and the literature that's already existing, we're looking at secondary information sources, yes, repositories that are existing, web pages of different organizations, but at the end of the day, we are relying on published resources, and there are abundance of unpublished resources and a lot that is happening at community level that does not feed into the systematic processes of the bigger institutions. And that was a major gap that we did also want to validate, verify, and really dig deeper into. So this is just to wrap up after this to say that this was a big, it was really a big accomplishment for us and progress for us to get to this point to say, by looking at the community engagement data that is existing within the humanitarian architecture right now, could we actually look at what type of community engagement data is actually captured within the humanitarian sector as of now, and in that documentation process? So this is some of what came out of it, where we looked at the community engagement data by clusters. So whether it's a health or child protection or food insecurity or WASH, the different clusters and the way that the humanitarian system is set up to respond. And what we did find that there were quite a bit of community engagement data, but oftentimes that community engagement data was limited to output level. And therefore, it was really looking at shorter term processes, whether it's like a meeting or a very short term initiative where community engagement is more of a means to an end. So if we want services to be reached to a community, we engage in some kind of community participation or some kind of process that is linked to community engagement, but not the full on where we're thinking about strengthening the capacity of the community, working with the community, continuing that relationship with the community, and leading into broader outcomes. So this was very telling because how that becomes captured into the programming processes and the planning processes and the resourcing processes, and what winds up actually impacting communities in the longer run is very limited. So this is just a real snippet and broad overview of what this project looked at, and I'll pause there because I'm to give some space for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania, for this presentation and for the last presentation from yesterday. So I will invite you, Rania, Laura, Pamela, and Fernanda, to stay 10 minutes more after the last presentation from Fernanda Baumhart to have a discussion between the four panelists and to give some insightful ideas for how to improve the community engagement and apply the innovation. So Fernanda, thank you for being the last panelist for today. Fernanda, she's a journalist and a humanitarian worker with more than 25 years of experience. She's an expert on community engagement. So Fernanda, thank you for your time and for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, hard task to be the last one, especially after so many brilliant panelists and presentations, but I'll do my best, especially to keep time. So when I received the invitation as an independent expert to talk at this great event, the panel title was Innovating to Realize Comprehensive Community Engagement. So immediately I thought, okay, what have I learned and what I'm still learning throughout this multiple deployments to multiple organizations as NORCAP and CDAC expert. And one of the things I've learned is that we need to go deeper. So I will try in the time that I have, which is probably less than 8 minutes, to provoke perhaps some reflections that I would like us to continue in different forums, in other events, which is about innovative leadership in order for us to reach community-centered humanitarian action. And what I'm bringing here is, it's a different type of presentation because I've used visual and design thinking, which I believe is quite innovative for our sector in a way, to present not data, but reflections. So our device, I invite everyone, let's put on community lenses right now. Let's just drop our logos, our colors, and let's try to undress and put ourselves on the ground in different crises. It doesn't matter which one, not only Colombia, but perhaps the most difficult ones that are currently in countries and situations that normally participation is not there in a governance type of way. Because as you know, most of the crises we operate, we are operating under conflicts that not necessarily are allowing free flow of communication, especially the different voices that often are reflecting different ways of thinking. So with those lenses, the state of play, and again, this was unpacked with visual thinking and design thinking, the base of this figure that we're watching here is actually multiple reports that I'm not going to list here because it's actually a combination of reports, of literature, and also my own experience as an expert, acting not only as a technical person on the ground with communities, carrying out participatory processes, trying to bring those voices into the system, but also as coordinator of working groups in different crises, as well as advisor at, as for instance, in Venezuela and the regional office of OCHA quite lately. But also as a consultant at the global level. Recently, I studied for an organization I'm not going to name, which I was invited to dig in deeper and to see what was going on in terms of the barriers and perhaps the things we need to change in order to reach and realize comprehensive community engagement with all the beautiful and amazing technology and brains out there and resources. So the state of play nowadays, some might say it looks like a circus. Others can say, well, it's actually a nice show. But overall, communities are not invited in. And CSOs, youth, women organizations, local NGOs are usually not running the show, even though we say that we should be centered our actions based on them. So we do have standards, we do have policies, we do have donors, but what's happening? Why are we not acting, course correcting on what we are listening, such as Kuja Kuja, amazing work. What's going on? Because this show or circles, or actually great coordination and logical spaces, we've been rolling out platforms such as hotlines, WhatsApp channels, and etc., to listen to the affected communities' voices. Are we listening? Are we piling these voices somewhere? What about the expectations that we don't even measure when we roll out lines? I'm not going to name contexts. I'm sure we can all relate. What do we do when we roll out lines and we don't act on what we've heard? What about raising expectations and perhaps creating harm? Do we do empowering when we roll out these platforms and lines and we don't course correct? What do we need to course correct? So there are many gaps at the organizational level and the humanitarian sector level. There are multiple brilliant initiatives, standards, guidelines, toolkits, commitments. They're competing with each other. Why are we not reaching and crossing the line? Why do we still see, or many still see, communities as numbers? Well, I'm going to risk saying here something that some of the more logical minds around might say, what is she talking about? Well, I'm talking about, not only I am talking about, in fact, I'm talking about change of mindsets. I'm talking about changing culture, because if we don't do that, we won't be able to use all the phenomenal technology out there to really break through and course correct. And why? Well, there are many whys. One of the whys is that we still operate based on supply driven and not demand driven. Because when we come in the crisis and context, we come with our show is ready to go. And perhaps that's one of the reasons we're not really realizing comprehensive community engagement. Because we need to institutionalize community engagement and for accountability to affected population, which is a commitment that we have at YASC level. We need to institutionalize it as the foundation because we cannot just be talking about data and all the other elements that are down here if we don't fix here, or the other way around, some may say. So community engagement and accountability must go into the DNA of every partner, of every organization operating, of every mind, every expert, every practitioner, and all across, vertical and horizontal. What do we need? We need to get into the core of project cycle management, PCM, which is very rigid, as we know. We have to, how many times I had to debate and discuss with colleagues from IM and other sectors, M&E, to incorporate certain elements in the PCM that are more community-centered. But why? Why are we doing these discussions down here? Because we need leaders to support us. We need a different kind of leadership. If not, we're going to be battling down here and wasting our time and energy and resources. And that's, I'm afraid that's what's happening overall. So we need a symbiotic approach. We need to come out of the circles into the circle and centered approach. And for that, ultimately, we need a call to responsibility. We need to call leadership. And most of us, unfortunately, we don't break through, or we're not heard up there in the leadership. So that's where we need to go. So I invite the donor, I invite the organizations here and the experts, practitioners, that we do need to have those hard conversations. Because if not, we're not gonna realize comprehensive community engagement. It requires a real brain. It requires braveness, a heart-centered leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, and thank you for provoking the discussion and the reflection around community engagement and accountability to affected population. So I will invite Pamela, Rania, Laura, and Fernanda to this panel discussion for 10 minutes. I will ask a couple of questions to you to answer each one answer the question and to discuss about the question. The first question is around how can community leaders promote innovation to address social challenges and achieve more effective community engagement at different levels, at national level, international level. So how can community leaders promote this innovation? Fernanda first, if you want.
Well, we need to hold leaders accountable. How do we do that? We need to give the floor to social organizations, but we need to hold leaders accountable, and leaders accountable at both the humanitarian sector and the authorities that we work with. Over.
Okay, thank you, Fernanda. Anyone want to respond? Rania?
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more with Fernanda. I absolutely 300% agree with her. I think it's one thing to say that, you know, how can community leaders promote? I mean, community leaders are already innovating and they are already working at community level and they're already delivering for their communities. That's why they are leaders. But besides that, when we think more broadly from an inclusion approach, you know, communities are making their own efforts. The accountability must be on the duty bearers in the rights language, right? It is the humanitarian system, it is the aid, it is the donors. We need to change our systems to recognize that and bring this into our systems. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Rania. Laura.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I agree with Fernanda and with Rania, but also just acknowledging that my perspective is working less with community leaders and more with large organizations. I think it goes both ways in terms of keeping people accountable and making sure that the push for innovation, I mean, drawing on the themes of consultation we've already talked about, but that it's when you innovate, you do so intersectionally, and you do so accountably, and you do so transparently, so that you can be held accountable when you're inviting those systems in.
Thank you, Laura. Pamela?
I also think that innovation often happens, well, we've all said the same thing, innovation happens at the community level, but resourcing and support and the political support and the infrastructure to do that is required. And we're seeing a little bit of that happen now, and I'm talking from a donor perspective, is there was a period in time, and it still exists, where, for example, resourcing coming to Indigenous communities in particular, it had to go through another organization, an ENGO or an NGO of some sort that had a long record of financial accountability. But the fact is what we found, and we all know, we've heard the stories, that a lot of those resources never got to the community, or a very small portion. A lot of work is being done to support the building of the infrastructure and the capacity at the community level, so that direct donations can happen there, which is where the most impact is happening. So I think that's really important as well, to think about moving forward in the future.
Thank you. So the second question for you is who should lead an organization information management for community engagement, and what resource should be put into play, and how to avoid having self-interest in community engagement with a predefined, already prepared humanitarian response? Let's start with Rania.
I was going to say, can you repeat? That was a very complicated question.
That's complex question. It's about who should lead as an organization on information management, the resource into play, and how to avoid having self-interest in community engagement with a predefined, already prepared humanitarian response. Who is the best organizations to collect information on community engagement to avoid this predefined, prepared humanitarian response?
I mean, I'll try to break it down into a couple of parts. I think that there is no one institution that can be the one that leads everything in terms of information management, in terms of community engagement. I think when we start to break it down into responsibility around data management and which levels, this is when we start to talk about who should be managing data. Oftentimes, for example, data is collected from communities. I'm not saying even with now at this point, from communities, and it's managed somewhere else. Or later down the line, they use this data for other projects or programs without even going back to the communities. So there's a lot of disconnect when we're thinking about from a data perspective and then from information management perspective. I think at all levels, there has to be more effort at the decentralization of information management, that data that is generated at community level should be owned by communities, should be managed by communities, and communities then should be able to use it to take their own decisions. If we really believe in community engagement, empowerment is an end. It's not a means because we want them to use services or we want to push people to do something, go get immunized, go do that. Like I think we need to really commit to the community engagement objectives and goals and then work from there. Of course, we're not going to unravel all of the institutions and the structures and the system right now, but I think, I think as Pamela said, all organizations now need to start to make the efforts at their level to ensure that we begin to decentralize these processes. And information management needs to be at the core of that because it influences how resources are allocated. Over.
Thank you, Rania. Laura?
Yeah, I won't, I mean, I agree with Rania, and so I won't repeat anything that she's already spoken to, but I will also add that as an IM practitioner and specialist who has been working in emergency management for, I think this is my 10th year, in a couple of months, one of the big challenges in such a large country like Canada is the fact that we don't have centralized data. And so I do think that there is a midpoint, not where we compromise on community ownership, but where there needs to be standards, and I don't think there is one agency either. I think that there's consultations and community ownership that need to be a part of these centralization discussions of what the minimum standards are around data availability when we're talking about disasters in particular. And so it can be something simple like building attributes and what the basic standards are around things like that. So more adding a consideration than answering the question on this one. I'll hand over the mic.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Fernanda.
Nothing to add. Agree. 100%.
Yeah, decentralized the information from each organization. So Pamela, anything to add?
I just want to pick up on just adding maybe one word that is important. It's data sharing. I think that's really what we're talking about, is not data collection, it's data sharing. And when you think about things that way, the standardization approach, it makes sense to communities. It makes sense to Indigenous peoples, of course, to have a standard level of mapping and data collection, but it's the sharing aspect, two-way, back and forth, that's really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela, and I agree with you with this last thing. It's more than collect information, is to share the information between the different organizations or different programs to avoid the duplications, to collect and to repeat the collect information from different communities. So thank you very much for your time, Rania, Laura, Fernanda, and Pamela, for your insightful reflections about innovation and participation at community level. So thank you for these presentations. We are wrapping up and end this discussion on this moment. So I will give the floor to Jeffrey to wrap up this session for today's session. So Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Sitong. So basically, I would like to thank you all for your participation today. Very stimulating discussion there at the end of the session. Fernando, we're going to put you first, not last, the next time. We appreciate all the contributions from the panelists. I would like to emphasize the central role of communities and the initiatives and information management tools discussed today. This is a very important point to be made that Rania was emphasizing in her closing remarks as well. So we had a bit of everything here. We had an experience with Ukraine, which my colleague Friedon presented from IMAP, focused on tailoring training for the unique context in the country for capacity building and localization. We also had initiatives with Kuja, Mawingo, and Corporación Misión Rural, all very interesting presentations, looking at how to involve communities and local organizations as central actors. In all these cases, the communities are not just passive recipients, but they're active promoters of the information collection process and information management process. There's been a lot of focus on rural areas in this case studies, which also presents specific challenges. I think all this highlights the importance of creating comprehensive initiatives in our daily work to ensure community participation. In closing, I'd like to invite you to join us tomorrow for the final day of this event, where we'll be discussing communication and digital access in conflict zones and hard to reach areas with interventions from a number of panelists. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks a lot for your participation today. Have a good afternoon or evening.